So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Lacey Opdycke is one of the public history research interns at the National Women's History Museum, and she's the curator of both the Women's Army Corps Female Soldiers in World War II and the Be a Marine, Free a Marine to Fight United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve exhibits. She is a graduate of Eastern Michigan University, where she earned a bachelor's degree in history with a minor in political science in 2018. She's currently a second-year graduate student at Eastern Michigan University, where she studies both history and cultural museum studies, and is working on her master's thesis, which focuses on the women Air Force service pilots of the Second World War. Her research interests include women's military history and general military history in both the 19th and 20th centuries. In her spare time, Lacey participates in historical reenactments as a living historian and historical interpreter, where she represents women of the Women's Army Corps and the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Lacey, as I said, is also the curator of the Women's Army Corps Female Soldiers in World War II exhibit, and we're so excited that she's able to be with us here this afternoon. So please welcome Lacey Opdycke. Lacey, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liz, for that introduction. So I have a lot of information today that I'm hoping to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. To begin, I will be going through the exhibit with you and offering a couple curators notes. So I'll be making note of some of the decisions that I made as a curator as we go through the exhibit today, as well as sharing the history of the United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve and the women Marines who served during the Second World War. In addition to adding some information about WRs, women's reservists, that didn't necessarily fit into the exhibit as I was curating it. There's a lot of information about these ladies. So I'd like to point out a couple themes before we get started. The first being hostility and perseverance. As we go through the exhibit today, you're going to notice this theme of hostility, and basically the WRs who wanted to become Marines faced so much hostility, you know, as Marines themselves, from men that were training them, from men outside of the Marine Corps, from Congress, all around. It was a hard time for these women to be accepted as Marines. And they persevered through this, as you'll see in the end, and they became Marines through and through. Additionally, I like to point out the notion of esprit de corps, and this was a popular notion among all Marines, which inspires enthusiasm, devotion, and a strong regard for the honor of the group, i.e. the Marine Corps, and represents the morale and camaraderie between them. It's really the spirit of being a Marine. And this notion was not lost among the women Marines who joined. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the first slide of the exhibit. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so first we have the foundations. And the exhibit begins with an anecdote. And when I began doing research on the WRs, this anecdote really stood out to me because I felt as if it represented the really rocky road that women were going to face in becoming Marines and being accepted as Marines. So at a dinner party on October 12th, 1943, Commandant of the Marine Corps, Major General Thomas Holcomb, was asked his thoughts about recruiting women into the Marine Corps. And before anybody could even respond, a large portrait of 5th Commandant Archibald Henderson, who is the longest serving Marine Corps Commandant, he served between 1820 and 1859, came crashing down before all of the guests. Now, we can only speculate how Archibald Henderson would have felt about the idea of including women into the Marine Corps. But I think that his portrait crashing down at the mention of including women was really representative of how absurd top Marine officials thought that this idea was early on. However, the idea of women serving in the Marine Corps and the armed forces in general wasn't totally unprecedented. During World War I, women were called to serve by the Marine Corps, the Army Signal Corps, and the Navy. And during this period, during World War I, dramatic changes in the status of American women occurred due to the widespread employment of women in United States industry. As the United States became involved in World War I, and men were volunteering themselves for the war effort, as well as being drafted by the hundreds, women took over as elevator operators, streetcar conductors, postmen, and industrial workers. And this manpower shortage at the industrial level quickly trickled over into military power. Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, was intrigued at this idea of possibly including women in the Navy, and he set to work seeing how the Navy could do this. And women were welcomed into the Navy under this vague language of the Naval Act of 1916, which never specified that it had to be men who were serving in the Navy. And some 12,500 yeomanettes, or yeoman, F for female, served in the Navy during the First World War. The act itself that allowed women in on a loophole read, all persons who may be capable of performing special useful service for coastal defense. So they were brought in into the Navy under that all persons clause within the act. But by July 1918, the Marine Corps was facing similar issues with manpower shortage. The commandant at the time, Major General George Barnett, dispatched memorandums to the office of the quartermaster, the paymaster, and the adjutant and inspector, asking about the feasibility of recruiting women to do the work. And as the word spread via newspaper after women were accepted to do these positions, women began flooding into recruitment offices by the thousands. And on August 13th, 1918, Mrs. Opha May Johnson became America's first woman Marine, and she was assigned as a clerk in the office of the quartermaster. And I find it interesting, this is actually a fact that the Marine Corps still teaches recruits today when they're coming in to become Marines. And here's a little fun fact. Although it was estimated that about 40% of the work in headquarters, Marine Corps headquarters, could be performed equally well by women, it was believed that a larger number of women would be needed to do the same amount of work. And the opinion expressed by experienced clerks at the headquarters was that the ratio would be about 3 to 2. So they believed it would take 3 women to do the amount of the work of 2 men, which by the end of the war proved, it wasn't the same. And this actually trickled over into the Second World War as well. So here I chose this image. It's an image of Marines being sworn in at a New York recruitment office in 1918. And if you look closely at all of the women who are looking very eager and excited to swear into the Marine Corps, they're actually wearing men's uniforms because they didn't have women's uniforms just yet. They weren't prepared and sent out to these women. So this was a great photo opportunity of these women becoming Marines for the very first time in history. And so we move back over to World War II. On July 30th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Public Law 689, known as the Navy Bill. And this established the Navy women accepted for volunteer emergency services, so the WAVES, who you may have heard of, and the United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve. Though they're separate branches, both the Navy and the Marine Corps operate under the Department of the Navy, so that's why they were created together under this bill. And don't be fooled by the date of the bill. The Marine Corps actually delayed the forming of the Women's Reserve for as long as feasibly possible, as they held on to this idea of the Corps as an exclusive club for Caucasian men, which we'll touch a little bit on later. And it wouldn't be until February 13th of 1943 that the USMCWR was formed. And they were actually the very last auxiliary of women to be formed out of all of the branches. So just as Commandant Barnett had done in World War I, and unable to stall any longer, Holcomb began his plans to include women Marines by contacting commanders at various Marine Corps posts around the country. He started asking them to begin thinking about how women could serve their post and how they could fill non-combat positions there, and also reminding these commanders to prepare for the fact that women were coming. It was happening. The goal early on was for 500 officers and 6,000 enlisted women, but by June 1944, the goal was expanded to include 1,000 officers and 16,000 enlisted women, and they were very successful in the recruitment efforts.
Present to you our guest of honor.
Let me pause that.
I'd like to...
And I really encourage you to go through the exhibit after this and listen to these really cool sound clips that I've included, as well as a video that is later on. I think it's great to hear, for example, Ruth here, you can hear her voice giving a speech as you're going through this exhibit. So obviously wary of accepting women as Marines, Thomas Holcomb and Marine Corps leadership needed to choose a capable woman to lead the reserves. And they found that in Ruth Cheney Streeter, who you see here on the screen. She was born on October 2nd, 1895, and she received her early education in Boston and spent 2 years at Bryn Mawr College, where she was the president of her class. In 1917, she married Thomas Winthrop Streeter, and she moved to Morristown, New Jersey. Together, they had 4 children, and she was involved in the community a lot. She was a member of 6 women's clubs, the Junior League, and she volunteered as a health and welfare worker for several statewide relief commissions. She was described as confident, spirited, patriotic, and a principled person. And an interesting fact about her, Ruth and her mother annually presented the Cheney Award to a member of the Army Air Corps for acts of valor or extreme fortitude or sacrifice in memory of her brother, William Halsell Cheney, who passed in an air collision over Italy in World War I. And this award was presented beginning in 1927 and is presented up until now. I think the last one was given in 2018. So that's an award that is still given today. And Ruth at the time was so sure that the United States would be entering the war, and partially inspired by her brother's service in the First World War, she studied to become a pilot, and she earned her commercial pilot's license at the age of 47. She wanted to fly for the military, and she attempted to join first the Women Air Force Service pilots multiple times, actually. However, she was rejected each time because she was quote unquote too old, per the letters that she received from the WASP. She was about 12 years over the limit, if I remember correctly. And she also offered her flight skills to the Waves, who I mentioned earlier, who were eager to use her plane, but could only offer a job to her as a ground instructor, which she didn't want to do. She wanted to fly for the war effort. So she declined the Waves' offer. But little did she know that she was being considered for the position of Director of the United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve by Virginia C. Gildersleeve, who was the Dean of Barnard College. Gildersleeve had recommended her along with 12 other outstanding women to be chosen for this role. And she was an excellent candidate for a multitude of reasons. She was the president of her class at Bryn Mawr College for 2 years. Although she didn't complete it, she had that under her belt. She had 4 children, 3 of which were serving in the military. She was a devoted wife, and she was extremely patriotic. And while you may be wondering, what does her being a wife have to do with any of this or any of that, the first 2 aspects of her character were extremely important. Holcomb himself personally believed that the success of the Women's Reserve depended solely on the character of its director. And Ruth served as the perfect example of a ladylike Marine for those who may be worried in the future about sending their daughters, sisters, cousins, whomever into the Marines to become Marines. And so Streeter was the first woman to hold the rank of Major in the Marine Corps. She was appointed to that rank on January 29th, 1943, when she became the first director of the USMCWR. She was later promoted to Lieutenant Colonel on November 22nd, 1943, and then later to the rank of Colonel on February 1st, 1944. Under her leadership, the USMCWR grew to approximately 1,000 officers and 18,000 enlisted women. And she resigned her commission on December 6th of 1945. In 1946, after the war, she was awarded the Legion of Merit for, quote, exercising judgment, initiative, and ability, and rendering distinctive service in directing the planning and organization of the Women's Reserve of the Marine Corps, and skillfully integrating women into the basic structure of the Corps. She was also awarded the American Campaign Medal, as well as the World War II Victory Medal. And so, when she was first established as director, it was her responsibility then to undertake running recruitment, training, and assigning women to various jobs where they were needed. And so here's another image of Ruth here on your screen. All right, and this is where we get the Be a Marine, Free a Marine to Fight slogan. So one of the most effective and widely known recruitment slogans was Be a Marine, Free a Marine to Fight. When the reserve was established in 1942, freeing a Marine for combat duties was one of the main objectives of the USMCWR to quickly address the surmounting manpower shortage. The slogan is also significant in the fact that it asserts the idea of women becoming Marines, nothing more, nothing less. And we'll talk a little bit more about that notion later on in the tour. Also, I'd like to point out, I personally think that the USMCWR has some of the most beautiful recruitment posters, as you can see here on the screen, featuring the slogan that we were just talking about. And this specific poster was pulled from the National Archives. And fun fact as well, as I'm looking at the red here, they actually, in their uniforms, they matched their red lipstick to the cords on their hat, as well as other aspects of their uniform, which we'll also touch about a little bit later. So when researching for an exhibit of this caliber and of this significance, it's always difficult to choose who and what to feature because there were so many compelling stories and successful women who served in the Corps. However, Mary Cugini Neko's story really caught my eye as I sifted through the hundreds of pages of oral histories in researching this exhibit. She was a second-generation immigrant born to Italian parents, and she and her family grew up relatively poor. She recalled being on welfare for most of her childhood and her father having an unhealthy relationship with work. She actually mentions in her oral history that her father was very wealthy in Italy, and so when he moved to America, he had a hard time with that aspect of working and earning money in that capacity. And so her mother was educated to become a teacher, but she never did. She never became a teacher as a result of marrying Mary's father. However, Mary's mother always told her, "This is America. You can be anything you want." And so Mary attended public school in the Boston area, and she graduated in 1942. And she recalls being made fun of for attending public school instead of parochial school. But from there, she took a civil service test and she worked for the US government in the US Department of Commerce as a statistical clerk. And she attended Boston University in the evenings. And she paid for her own schooling with her job. And she also gave money to support her parents and her 4 younger siblings. But when the war broke out, Mary had a boyfriend who joined the Marines, and he ended up wounded and healing from his wounds in the hospital. And so this allowed them to have time to speak and share letters with one another. And this is when Mary became contemplative about what she could personally do to support the war effort. And ultimately, she decided to enlist in November 1944 in the Women's Reserve in the Marine Corps. And one of my favorite quotes from her oral history transcript really sums up why I thought her story was so compelling. And it goes, I quote, "I joined the Marines because it says free a Marine to fight. It was these big banners up, free a Marine to fight, and that's what I did. I did free a Marine to fight, and I often wonder who it was and if he's still alive today." And so Mary worked in reimbursement in the Marine Corps headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, and in May 1946, she was discharged as a colonel. And I'd say that she did her job and she felt very proud of it. And again, I have really cool video in this exhibit if you'd like to visit it a little bit later on after the tour. And so moving on, here we have page 81 of Life magazine from the May 27th, 1944 edition featuring women Marines drilling. And this magazine is significant because it features a statement from Holcomb in regards to the name of the WRs. So the American public adored the clever nicknames and acronyms given to the other women's auxiliaries. For example, the WASP, the Waves, the WACs, and they were eager to help the Marines decide on a nickname for their ladies as well. And so Marine Corps headquarters was bombarded with suggestions, including Mars, Femarines, Whams, my personal favorite, Dainty Devil Dogs, Glamarines, Women's Leatherneck Aids, and even Submarines, just to name a few. However, Holcomb, excuse me, I lost my spot. Holcomb was not fond of the idea of allowing these Marines to have nicknames, and he responded to the request in this magazine, "They're Marines. They don't have a nickname and they don't need one. They get their basic training in a Marine atmosphere at a Marine post. They inherit the traditions of the Marines. They are Marines." And this is interesting to me because it's one of those distinctions between women Marines and the other branches or auxiliaries of women. While they did experience severe hostility toward them as women, they were accepted, forced or not, as Marines. Nothing more, nothing less, once again. And so, as we spoke about earlier, Something not lost among the WRs was the Marine Corps esprit de corps. The successful recruitment of women Marines is attributed to the gleaming reputation of the Marine Corps itself. For example, when Mary Neko's unsupportive aunt told her that only bad girls go into the Army, she proudly and fiercely corrected her, saying, quote, "I'm in the Marines." And Jo Corn Stewart, who you see here on your screen, is another example. She was a shy young recruit who was also enamored with the reputation of the Corps. Coming from a family full of service members, she joined the Marines alongside her husband. She married her husband at 19 because she, in her own words, felt that they were simply the best. And we'll touch a little bit more on this gleaming reputation of the Marine Corps too. And so just a quick note on images as we come to this slide. I had the opportunity to work with quite a different institutions and quite a few different archivists, but I worked specifically on this image with archivist Deborah Richards to obtain a couple images for this exhibit. This is from Mount Holyoke Archives. And my main goal when curating a virtual exhibit is to find images that haven't been widely viewed by the public, because I want the images to be, and the text to be, equally exciting as they are informational. So when I stumbled across this photo in particular on a random webpage online, I knew I had to do absolutely everything I could to find this and get permissions. This is one of the most beautiful photos I think I've ever seen. And so to begin with boot camp and training, the most important aspect of training was early on, was to establish a base of officers who could effectively lead the enlisted women. So in March of 1943, 71 officer candidates arrived to the U.S. Midshipman School Women's Reserve at Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts, as you see here in this image. 2 weeks later, 722 boots, that's their nickname for the enlisted recruits, were ordered to the U.S. Naval Training School Women's Reserve at Hunter College in New York. And these colleges were chosen as the WR training centers because they were already set up for the waves, and because of how prestigious they were as specifically women's colleges. They were deemed an appropriate training setting for women because they were these women's colleges. And so the women chosen to become officers started off as privates, and after 4 weeks of successful training, they would be promoted to officer cadet and they would receive their OC pins. And if any WR was unsuccessful in completing the first 4 weeks, they had the option to either be sent to Hunter College to complete enlisted training, or they could be discharged. And if any of the officer candidates completed the 8-week course but didn't pick up commission, she would be forced to submit a formal resignation to the commandant. And for requirements to join, they were pretty similar. They had to be United States citizens, not married to a Marine, either single or married but with no children under 18, height not less than 60 inches, weight not less than 95 pounds, good vision, and teeth. And a woman who we'll talk about a little bit later, Gladys Naipan, actually remembers going in for her physical and she had a little bit of an underbite, and this became a big problem for the Marine Corps because they were so strict in these requirements to join. And she said they brought it up and they were all adamant about it, and she thought it strange because the underbite never bothered her. However, it was swept under the rug and she was allowed to join. That's one of the things that stood out in terms of these requirements. And so here, the first 4 weeks of training, you see here, it's 2 Marines and a wave in the center here. And the first 4 weeks of training was almost exactly the same as waves, because they were stationed at the same training centers because they were made for waves, except for drill. Excuse me. And so the Marine Corps drill instructors were male Marines transferred from Parris Island, the Marine Corps recruit depot, and the women often experienced extreme hostilities from them. They also studied Marine Corps specific topics such as Marine Corps administration and courtesies, map reading, interior guard, safeguarding military information, and physical conditioning, all taught by male Marines. And this was similar to what the enlisted women at Hunter College underwent as well, as you'll see here in this image here of regimental training. This was at Hunter College in New York. And so we move on to Gladys A. Nypan. So another curator's note, a majority of WRs were trained at Camp Lejeune, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But I came across Gladys Nypan's story in the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project, and I was quickly enthralled because she was one of the early boots who trained at Hunter College. And I'm also really excited to have this opportunity to give a tour today because there's only so much information that you can include in an online exhibit. And so I'm able to expand on the stories of these WRs a little bit. And I'd like to do that with Gladys's life. So Gladys was one of 8, and she grew up in a small town in Minnesota. And after Pearl Harbor, she and her girlfriends became very aware that if the United States was going to win, it would take every single strength that the US had to offer, including women. So she and her friends would sit around and examine all of the recruitment information that they were sent in the mail. And they decided that the next steps would probably be to join the war effort. And she remembers that out of 8 of her friends, and she had 8 siblings as well as 8 friends that she recalls in her story. Out of 8 friends, 3 of them joined up. She and one of her friends joined the Marines while the other joined the Navy. And with Gladys, we again see the Marine Corps reputation shining through. She said, quote, "I became so aware of the Marine Corps uniform. I thought it was the sharpest looking, and so I admit to that, but not to forget that I was aware of the reputation of the Marines, and I had been to enough parades in my life and seen their excellence and the fact that they were always so sharp. And I thought, if I'm going to be joining, I'm going to join the sharpest outfit, and was convinced." So she joined in 1943, and one of the most interesting things she said was the acknowledgement that the men who were pulled from Paris Island hated their jobs, hated training the women, and thought that they would be better off elsewhere. She said, quote, "Our drill instructors were so tough. They were men who probably didn't like to be where they were. It had been a while before the Marines were going to let us join their ranks anyway, and then look at what job they inherited, drilling women. You kind of felt that. But eventually she stopped taking it to heart, as well as the other WRs. And once she realized that they had to be this way, partially, in order to create Marines out of the women." And so Gladys's story actually provides the perfect segue into uniforms because she was so in love with them. And the story of the USMCWR uniform is quite interesting as well. So just as the male Marine uniforms, the women's uniform was just as significant. So much so that a recruitment circular in 1943 read, quote, "The Marine Corps wants you to look your best at all times. The uniform you wear will be designed to be comfortable, practical, and extremely attractive. When you don them, you will know the pride of wearing a uniform that is a symbol of valor and bravery everywhere." And so before anyone else was recruited into the Marines, including Director Ruth Cheney Streeter, Mrs. Anne E. Lentz, a civilian clothing expert, was commissioned a captain, becoming the first women officer in the Corps. And she was only supposed to be on a 30-day assignment from the WWII, the Women's Army Corps, but she ended up staying with the Marine Corps Women's Reserve after serving with them to create the uniform. And so recruits were promised uniforms when they arrived to boot camp. However, this didn't always happen, and the earliest officer candidates and recruits actually trained in their civilian clothing for 2 weeks. They were told to bring enough clothes to last 2 weeks, 2 pairs of comfortable dark brown laced Oxfords, as according to the instructions, quote, "Experience had proven that drilling tends to enlarge in the feet." And when the uniforms did arrive, they were fitted to each woman to ensure proper and perfect fit so that they looked sharp and as good as Marines as they could possibly be. So for the sake of simplicity, they had a winter uniform, a summer uniform, obviously with variations as time went on, and also utility uniforms for work. And another fun fact, they were issued the male P-41 utility uniform for wear on duty while the women's versions were in production. That is, I think you can see my cursor, the woman on the farthest left is wearing the P-41 uniform. And In her book, A Few Good Women, Inga Fredrickson Ferris stated that the women preferred the men's versions as it made the women look saltier, made them look more aggressive, more like Marines, and that's all they wanted to be. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Camp Lejeune. So eventually both Mount Holyoke and Hunter College became so overwhelmed with women that the Marine Corps consolidated both schools and transferred them over to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. They realized that there were some benefits from doing so. For example, they could better instill the Marine esprit de corps. They could offer training specific to Marine Corps topics rather than naval topics. And they had the opportunity to, the women had the opportunity to engage in training activities that typically wouldn't be offered to women elsewhere. And so both Ruth Cheney Streeter and Major Edward Hunter Hurst, who you see on the screen with Streeter here, he was in command of the officer candidates at Mount Holyoke, pushed for opportunities for women to train with weapons and hand-to-hand combat, and to watch other training exercises conducted by men in order to see the men that they were freeing to fight. Some women Marines were actually qualified shots on the range, that is, but there was a point during their history that this was discontinued due to some outside pressures. Namely, it was a big no-no for women in the United States military to be handling weapons. They were specifically reserved for non-combat positions. So there was a lot of outside pushing in on this. Essentially, while official records state that they received weapons instruction, some veterans' accounts actually state that they indeed did qualify on the range. And so again, this was partially thanks to Major Hurst's efforts. He wrote to Brigadier General Littleton Waller, quote, "I found myself wishing more and more that we could include some weapons instructions, at least pistol for our women. I have found that the women come into the Marine Corps expecting to learn to shoot, and I, of course, would like to see them become the first women's reserve in the country to take up that specialty of their men if headquarters considered the idea at all feasible." And interestingly enough, he claimed to have the nerve to ask this because on a tour, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt asked him how the women were going to be able to learn to shoot, where they were going to be conducting this type of training. And she was surprised to learn that while other women in other countries were being trained on weapons, women in the United States military were not. And so, unfortunately, one thing that hadn't changed from the days at Mount Holyoke and Hunter College was that the male drill instructors were not happy. The last thing they wanted to be doing was training a bunch of women to become Marines, and they made this very, very obvious. In addition to being hyper aggressive in their training styles, they also called the women derogatory terms. One example was calling them BAMs, or broad-assed Marines, and they weren't shy about being blatantly rude toward the women Marines. One anonymous WR felt that drill instructors resented the women, quote, more than a battalion of Japanese troops, which is very significant because this is who the Marine Corps was fighting at the time. Another WR, Marjorie Ann Kuttner, recalled a particularly mean-spirited stunt pulled by a group of Seabees who corralled every stray dog in the area, shaved them like poodles, painted BAM across their sides, and then set them free to roam the ranks of a graduating WR platoon. And despite Holcomb's rule of no nicknames, as we discussed earlier, it got so bad that it began to affect the morale of both the director and the women Marines themselves. And so when he found out about the verbal and psychological abuse, he was furious. And he wrote in 1943 that this behavior, quote, indicates a laxity in discipline, which will not be tolerated. Commanding officers will be held responsible. And eventually the hostilities did calm down, but they were not gone. Don't be fooled, they were still there, although they were reaching this mutual agreement. And some male Marines were coming to love their female Marines. This hostility did not disappear all the way. And so moving on from training and boot camp, once boot camp was completed, it was time for the WRs to be assigned to either a specialist school or a job assignment. And only selected WRs were chosen to attend specialist schools offered by schools run, these schools were run by civilians, the Army, the Navy, as well as the Marine Corps. And by the end of the war, there were 30 specialist schools who were available to the women Marines. Some examples include Aviation Machinist Mate, as seen in the photo here on your screen, Link Training Instructor, aviation storekeeper, cooks and bakers, motor transport, quartermaster, and non-commissioned officers. So these courses varied in length between 4 and 22 weeks, depending on what you were training to become. And by the end of the war, about 9,000 women in the Marines completed specialist training specifically. And in March 1943, the job classification was set up to assist in matching these women to the jobs where they were needed the most. Captain Cornelia Williams, who held a PhD in psychology, was in charge of this task at the Women's Reserve section of the detail branch. And basically each WR was interviewed and tested, and the classification section would then determine their eligibility for a specialist school and assignment to jobs. So not every female Marine went through specialist training. If you came in with specific experience from a job per se, you would be assigned to a job similar to that in the Marines, or based on the testing that you conducted, or you went under, excuse me. So in all, there were approximately 200 jobs that women Marines could conduct or could be. And this was a big step up from their World War I predecessors. And these jobs included photographer, parachute rigger, radio operator, motor transport driver, post exchange manager, control tower operator, automotive mechanic, aerial gunnery instructor, and so many more. And so, unlike the WWII and the Army nurses who served overseas in all theaters of the war, the USMCWR were restricted under the Naval Reserve Act of 1938 to the continental United States. However, after a year of intense back and forth between both the House and the Senate, excuse me, I lost my spot again. But so after this debate, Public Law 441 was signed into law on September 27th of 1944. And this law basically modified the existing Department of Navy regulations and, quote, permitted female naval personnel to serve on volunteer basis anywhere within the Western Hemisphere, including Alaska and Hawaii. So there were several factors in choosing which WRs would be permitted to serve in Hawaii, and they had to be responsible, mature, adaptable, and emotionally stable, to name a few characteristics. Their length of service helped determine who would be chosen. They needed to be on active duty for at least 6 months, but mainly depended on the classification of the men who needed to be released in Hawaii. And these jobs included clerical, communications, quartermaster, telephone operator, mechanical, things of that sort. And they had to be, the women, the women who were chosen had to be good health, good conduct, and good work records, along with being free of dependents at home who could possibly need them to come back to the continental United States. Their service overseas lasted for roughly a 2-year period once they were called, and leave was only authorized for emergency purposes. On January 25th, 1945, 160 enlisted WRs and 5 officers set sail on the SS Matsonia for Honolulu. And 3 days later, as you see in this image on the screen, they arrived ready for duty in their winter greens. And we move on to the diversity slide. So in my opinion, this is probably one of the most alarming and interesting aspects of the Marine Corps during this specific period. So in addition to attempting to bar women completely from their ranks to uphold the all-male sanctity of the Corps, they were also very selective over the races of women and even men that they would allow to join. The Marine Corps completely barred African American women and Japanese American women from joining, and this is probably not shocking due to the fact that the Marines were mainly located in the Pacific Theater of Operations where they fought the Japanese, and due to the fact that the United States government was actively forcing Japanese Americans into internment camps during this period. African Americans, on the other hand, had been barred from the Marine Corps for a very long time. Between the late 1700s and the early 1940s, the Marine Corps mainly followed a discriminatory policy that barred African Americans from joining the Corps completely. And it wasn't until June of 1942, with the issuing of executive orders like Executive Order 8892, that they opened their doors to male African American recruits. And it's important to note that while the Corps did begin accepting African Americans to come into the Corps during this time in the early 1940s, it wouldn't be until the late 1960s that full integration would completely occur. They did, however, allow for Native Americans to join their ranks. And as early as World War I, the Marine Corps recruited Native American men to serve as code talkers, who used their lesser-known native language to send messages across the battlefield in an encrypted sort of way. Minnie Spotted Wolf was the first Native American woman to enlist in the USMCWR, and she is the woman's reservist who you see here on the left. And unfortunately, I wish I could have found more information about her, but a lot of what I was finding in my research was kind of repetitive. She was born and raised on a farm in Montana, where she helped her family attend the farm. She believed that all of the chores she completed on the farm, including breaking horses and driving 2-ton trucks, really prepared her for Marine Corps boot camp. In fact, she became a motor transport driver in the Corps and served in both California and Hawaii. She was discharged from the Marines in 1947, and after her military service, she married a farmer named Robert England, and she went to college to become an elementary school teacher, and she served as a teacher for 29 years. When she passed away in 1988, she was actually buried in her Marine Corps uniform, which again, I think kind of encompasses that esprit de corps that is always with Marines, even after their service. Once a Marine, always Marine. And so we come to the end of the war. After the announcement of VJ Day in August 1945, all recruiting for the Women's Reserve ceased. Though all of the women who were currently in training, it was a very small amount, were allowed to complete their boot camp and they were assigned to duty. But Colonel Ruth Cheney Streeter retired on December 7th of 1945. She believed that her job was done, the war was over, and Colonel Catherine A. Towle, who again you see here on the screen in this very lovely picture, was promoted to the second director of the USMCWR. And so demobilization started taking place during this period. The adjusted service rating system, like the one used with the male Marines, was employed to help with the demobilization of the WRs. Basically, they were given discharge credits based on the length of service, and the number of required credits for to be discharged for women was 25, whereas for men it was set at 85, because men could earn credits based on combat, based on how many dependents they had at home, as well as their length of service, whereas women Marines, it was only based on the length of their service. And so the Women's Reserve was set to close on September 1st, 1946. They began setting up a 2-week rehabilitation school at Marine Corps headquarters and Camp Lejeune. And here the WRs learned about their rights and benefits under the Veterans Administration, as well as the GI Bill of Rights. Letters of recommendation were written for women returning to civilian employment, and credit requests were made to high schools, so these women could earn credits for the training that they underwent as Marines. They also gave women information for colleges and any entrance exams they may needed to take to enroll in college. And by December 7th, 1945, the USMCWR had been reduced to 2/3 its original size of 18,000 to 19,000 women. By September 1st, 1945, the remaining WRs, with a few exceptions, were operating mainly as volunteers. And so Colonel Catherine A. Towle returned to civilian life in August of 1946 when the Women's Reserve was deactivated. However, a couple of years later, women would become permanent members of the military service. This is not surprising because many high-up members of all of the branches were completely supportive of keeping women within their ranks where they could be beneficial, because they had done such a wonderful job, they had proved themselves in serving their country. And so it's no surprise that there was a fight over the next couple of years to keep women. In June 1948, President Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act into law, and this allowed for women to serve as permanent members of the Marine Corps, the Army, the Navy, and the newly constructed Air Force. Commandant Lieutenant General A.A. Vandergrift, quote, said, "It was with some hesitation that the Marine Corps admitted women to its ranks in February 1943. But during the intervening years, they have made a most valuable contribution to the Corps. As the time comes to release them, I am reminded again of the important part they have played in support of our combat Marines while the actual fighting was in progress. I wish to express to the members of the Women's Reserve the appreciation of the Marine Corps for the valuable contribution they have made for its success. They have performed their duties in a manner that evokes the admiration and praise of their fellow Marines, and their conduct and appearance both on and off duty have been exemplary and a source of pride to us all. And Commandant Holcomb, who served as commandant during the war, who was very vocal about his disdain for women serving in the Marines, said, "Like most Marines, when the matter first came up, I didn't believe women could serve any useful purpose in the Marine Corps. Since then, I've changed my mind." So again, it's not shocking that this legislation was signed into law to keep women within the ranks of the military. And since World War II, where women provided concrete proof, quote unquote, that they could handle military life and duties, women have earned their rightful place in the military and have been consistently testing boundaries throughout history. On September 10th, 1949, Annie E. Graham of my home state, Michigan, she was from Detroit, Michigan, and Anne E. Lamb became the first African-American female recruits to arrive at Paris Island for boot camp. This in itself was monumental for the Marine Corps in general and for Black women, based on the exclusionary record of the Corps in the past. In 1965, Rose Franco became the first Hispanic woman to be promoted to Chief Warrant Officer. Angela Salinas was the first woman to command a Marine Corps recruit depot and the first Hispanic woman to become a general in the Marines in 2010. In 1967, Major Sergeant Barbara Jean Dolinsky became the first woman to serve in a combat zone in Vietnam, where she served as administrative chief at U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam Combat Operations Center in Saigon. And just last year, in June 2019, Captain Annalise Statz became the first female Marine to pilot an F-35B fighter jet and complete that training. And she joined the Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121, which has its roots in World War II, which I think is really interesting. And this is a photo of Annalise Statz here that I pulled from the Marine Corps website. And while women have proven themselves time and time again within the military and have created an amazing name for themselves, we can't just paint a rosy picture of their service altogether. Women Marines and women across all military branches face very unique challenges that contribute to the lower number of enlistees. Another curator's note about this image specifically, I chose this image because it represents the strange inequalities that women faced even in their uniforms. So this image is from 2018, and it shows Private First Class Kathy Espinoza inspecting the uniform of Private Arella Alayman at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island. This was the first company of female Marines to debut the Corps' latest dress uniform for women. It was the new jacket. And the new coat featured the iconic Mandarin collar, which is the high neck collar, white belt, and gold waist plate seen on that of male Marine uniforms, and mostly resembled the male version completely. And this came about from a survey conducted where women Marines expressed that their current uniforms weren't even recognizable as Marine Corps uniforms because the male version was so traditional and so highly recognized. So they were really interested in being able to wear a similar, or if not the same, uniform. And so this battalion, or this group, was the first to graduate in said uniform. And then moving back to statistics a little bit, according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, 23% of women reported sexual assault and 55% of women reported some form of sexual harassment. Again, one of these issues that women have in joining the Marines and the military in general. And even then, women have been limited in their capabilities to serve based on their gender, because it wasn't until 2015 that women Marines were permitted to serve in the Marine Corps Infantry. Which even then, the Marine Corps fought by asking for a waiver to not integrate women into these combat positions, even against the Pentagon's 2013 order. And today, women are still kept separate from men during their initial boot camp training as well. They're trained at Paris Island, and they form the 4th Recruit Training Battalion. And while the Marine Corps is trying to integrate their training and saying that they will be working on integrating, this is only for large-scale training operations. Otherwise, they're still kept separate. And so in the end, women only make up 8.3% of the Marine Corps. And while the numbers prove that there's still a great deal of work to be done for equality, I think we can recognize the importance of the Women's Reserve in the push for continued progress as they serve as that ground one for Marines, women Marines today. And with that, that is all I have for you today. That is my exhibit, and I would be so happy to take any questions that you might have.
And thank you, Lacey, so much for giving us that background and perspective on your wonderfully curated exhibit. We do have some questions that have come in.
Okay.
So the first question is, why did you choose to focus on women's military history?
So I think that I chose to focus on women's military history kind of on a whim. I was actually attending, so my boyfriend is a living historian and interpreter, and I was attending an air show with him. And I met up with some friends, and they noticed that I was really intrigued by the airplanes. And they said to me, do you want to start a group that represents the women Air Force service pilots? And I said, of course I do. So I started up a group, and I started them in living history. And then that trickled over, because I was working on my undergraduate degree at the time, that trickled over into my professional research interests. And from the WASP, it has expanded to all of the other auxiliaries of women in the military. In World War II specifically, I was really interested in the Civil War and kind of like the hidden women soldiers who disguised themselves. So yeah, it was mainly living history.
And are there any pictures of the first female Marine? Was that Opha May Johnson? Are there any pictures that exist of her?
There are images that exist of her. I was just having a hard time finding permissions for them to include in the exhibit. But if you Google her name, pictures will pop up of her. There's a very beautiful portrait of her, actually.
And that's Opha May, is O-P-H-A
Yes.
M-A-E, and her last name is Johnson.
Correct.
And this I found really very interesting, and I thank Pamela who sent this comment in. If you go back to the slide, Lacey, of the uniforms, and they had that wonderful photo of all the women wearing the uniforms, we had the comment from one of our attendees that the woman in the middle is her mother.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so wonderful.
Yeah. So if you know, I don't know how to get more information about her, but it is very interesting to know that that we do have somebody here who knows somebody in one of these images.
That is so cool. That is so cool.
Was there a record of what these women did after World War II ended? I know when you spoke about Minnie, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, and you had some information kind of about her, what she did post-war. Is there a record of what these women did after World War II ended?
Yeah, so I personally don't know a ton about what a lot of them did after the war, really on World War II. However, if you go into, for example, the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project, you can sift through hundreds and hundreds of oral histories of these women who talk about their lives after the war as well. And you can find a lot of these in interviews, oral histories, and things of that sort, specifically from the women themselves.
Great. Okay, here is a question from Zaina. It's regarding the high school credits and letters of recommendation. Do you know if those benefits were something the USMCWR used as incentives in recruiting, or is it something they realized they could give as a benefit to women being discharged?
Yeah, so a lot of the recruitment efforts did basically pull women in, saying you can get amazing opportunities to train on jobs you might not have otherwise. You can gain these really important skills that can be transferred over into life after the war. So definitely, they were incentives for women to be brought in.
Right. Did members of the Women's Reserve receive pensions?
Yes, I believe. I would have to double check, but they were granted everything under the GI Bill of Rights, as well as anything offered by the Veterans Administration, just as the men had received.
Right. Talk a little bit more about your research and how you kind of put this together. Were you able to interview any of the Women Reserve World War II veterans personally? Do you rely primarily on recorded oral histories? Can you give us a little 60-second background as to how you kind of put this together.
Got it. All right. So I start off with these exhibits, basically creating an outline of what I already know. And then I start diving into primary sources. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to interview any WRs personally, specifically. Unfortunately, as they're getting older, it's kind of hard to find them. And so I relied very heavily on oral histories and oral history transcripts, if they were available. I focused a lot, like when I found a topic that I was interested in and I had a woman that I was really compelled by, I'd go into her transcript, say, for example, the uniform slide, and I would type in uniform and see if anything popped up that she might have been taught. And a lot of my research was really just spending hours and hours reading every oral history transcript from the women's reservists that I could find, because I don't necessarily want to force the story. I want to use women's stories who were very compelling and who were, who tell the story for me, because it's not my job to tell the history, it's their job to tell the history. And I focused specifically on a couple secondary sources. There's one titled Free a Marine to Fight, and that offered a really good rundown of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, and that helped me pick topics that I wanted to focus on as well.
Great. And then another personal question is, are you or your family in the service?
So I am not in the service. As I mentioned, I think before, my boyfriend is a Marine, and I actually don't have anybody in my close family who is in the service. My great uncle or great uncle King, he served in the Army Air Forces, but I unfortunately didn't know him very well. But everybody asks me that, actually. They're like, you must have family members. And I'm like, no, I just find it interesting.
And I can speak very personally to this. You mentioned esprit de corps a lot as you were going through this exhibit, and the pride that that Marines take in their appearance and everything. My grandfather was a Marine during World War II, and he was a first alternate for West Point. So he was looking to go into the Army. And then he was in college, and a Marine Corps recruiter came in and gave a speech. And my grandfather was so impressed with his uniform and how sharp he looked that he walked out of there and immediately signed up to go into the Marine Corps. So kind of that whole esprit de corps, that pride that they take in their appearance, and just this kind of this feeling that they have. I can speak very personally to that because they do have that connection.
Yeah, every oral history that you read, it's always, I was so impressed with the reputation, I was impressed with the look, the uniform, very much that esprit de corps.
Okay, so we can do one more question. Okay. What is the difference between the capacity that women served as Marines in World War I versus World War II?
Yeah, so in World War I, they were very limited on what they could do. They mainly served in like clerical duties and administrative duties, like clerks, typists, secretaries, things of that sort. And there was actually only 305 Marinettes, as they're called, who served during World War I, whereas in World War II, there were roughly 19,000 who served throughout the war. And they had 200 plus different jobs that they could do. And a lot of them worked in aviation, which I think is interesting. So their job roles were expanded. The idea of what women could do in World War II versus World War I was expanded a lot more.
Great. Well, unfortunately, that is all of the time that we have today. This exhibit is available on our website, womenshistory.org. It's in our online exhibits category. This is the final exhibit in a 5-part series that we've been working on for about 1.5 years now. We do have exhibits on the WASPs, the WAVES, the WAC, the SPARs, which were the women in the Coast Guard, and then finally the U.S. Marine Corps Women's Reserve. So we do have all 5 of these exhibits on our website. If you're interested in going through, I know Lacey had talked about, she has some recordings and some videos in the exhibit. If you'd like to go through, please do that. It is available. This presentation, again, is being recorded, so we will have this presentation available up on our website in our Sundays at Home section in the next few days. So if you're interested in this, if you know of somebody who would be interested that wasn't able to attend today, it will be available for viewing in the next few days. As I mentioned, we do have some other upcoming programs. On Wednesday, November 18th at noon, we have a children's book author reading her book as a part of a Brave Girls virtual story time. We also have another Sundays at Home program a week from today at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So please take a look at our website. We're continually updating our resources and exhibits, as well as the programming that we're doing. So thank you so much to all of you for being with us today. We really appreciate your support and your time. Thank you to Lacey for such a wonderful exhibit, as well as a wonderful presentation today. And we certainly hope to see all of you again at a future program. So thank you all so much. We appreciate your time. If you have any additional questions that we were not able to get to today, please send an email to history@womenshistory.org. We're happy to answer those questions or forward them along to Lacey if you'd like as well. So thank you all again. We appreciate you, and we hope to see you soon. So goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.